Okay, we are in the eighth of our 12 lessons. Hard to believe it's already number eight. But uh, this evening, we're going to be in Thyatira. And hopefully there it goes, Thyatira. So we're following the order that we believe they would have been delivered in. It's the order in the text. And so after Pergamum is the letter to Thyatira, and the road just sort of curves around there towards Thyatira. So hopefully what we're going to do made sense. But just to recap the other letters that we've seen in chapter 2, we had the message to Ephesus. Return to your first love. They had some difficulty. We ran across the Nicolaitans in Ephesus, and we're going to see maybe a bit more of that tonight, but not by that name, but it looks like some more of that. Second letter to Smyrna. Remain faithful, and you will receive the crown of life. The thing was, there's nothing negative said about Smyrna. Then last week we went to Pergamum. Pergamum was holding fast to the name of Jesus during persecution and had already resulted in the death of some. But there were problems. It involved the teaching of Balaam and the Nicolaitans. There you have them again, both of which seem to involve compromise with idolatry. And if they overcame, they were told and remained faithful, they would be blessed. So that brings us to the last letter in chapter 2, which is the letter to Thyatira. Um, I've taken William Ramsey's subtitle for this one in my own notes, and he subtitled this letter, Weakness Made Strong. And hopefully that'll come out as we go through the text. And as always, we're going to be looking at basically the same three things we've looked at in each lesson. We're going to look a little bit about the history of Thyatira. Let you in on something here. We don't know all that much, but what we do know, I'll try to bring out. We're going to see a little tour of the archaeological site. I'll say something about that as well. And we're going to examine the letter, the message that Jesus had for them. Now, on our tour, we left Istanbul. I didn't have that coming in right. And I goofed that one totally. Get back there, John. So anyway, on our tour, we landed in Istanbul, traveled on down. The first city we went to is Pergamum, and that's where it was. We were supposed to then, on the day we went to Pergamum, go on to Thyatira. That's where the line continues on. But our bus broke down, and we went straight to Izmir, hoping to see Thyatira the next day. The next day, the bus continued to have problems, and we had to abandon the idea of seeing the ruins of this city. So I've not been to Thyatira. It's the one we've not been to. All the photos I'm going to use, I will show you some of the site, are either from Wikipedia or from the Pictorial Library of Bible Lands, which is a set of biblical sites, photos that the British Bible School purchased. As I said, we don't know much about the city, especially in comparison with what we know about the other cities that we've studied. And there isn't all that much archaeology in the ancient city of Thyatira either. So none of that helps a bit, but we do know a few bits about it. Thyatira, and hopefully you can see some of this. I found a relief map, but it sits in a long valley which extended north and south, connecting the Hermus and the Caicos valleys. Through this valley, there is a stream which joined the Lycus River, and Thyatira was on the left bank of this river. It was one of the major roads of Roman Asia. All communication between the valleys to its north and its south had to come through Thyatira. It was also the imperial post road where the emperor would send out communication. So it was a bit of an important city, and it was in a different sort of location, not on the hilltop or even a harbor city like we've seen before. This is a woodcut, by the way, from the 1800s from a sketch of what Thyatira was like then. And maybe just gives a little bit of the taste of the hills and the valley and whatnot. But Thyatira itself was founded by Seleucus the First. If you remember, we've mentioned him 2 or 3 times in these lessons. He was the Greek general who received this area after Alexander the Great's death. Although, even though he founded Thyatira as a Greek city, before that, there was a village there. So it's been inhabited for a long, long, long time. The village before Seleucus was built around a central temple. In the north of it was the kingdom of Lysimachus, who ruled the northern and coastal area as far as Ephesus. And Thyatira became a home to a colony of Macedonian soldiers who lived there from 300 to 282 BC. So keep that in mind. Thyatira is basically what we would call a garrison city. Soldiers would have lived here. Control of this area varied between the Seleucid kings and the Pergamanian kingdom. And you can see where Thyatira is, hopefully on this map, and Pergamum just up to the left of it. Initially, Seleucus encouraged the revolt by the Pergamanians to weaken Lysimachus, who is just to the north. But once Lysimachus was dead, they didn't have anything that united Seleucus with the locals, the Pergamanians. And Thyatira became a useful garrison town to control that major road that went through the valley. Sometimes the Seleucid kings had it, and then the the Pergamanian kings would have it, and it would go backwards and forwards. But as long as the kings of Pergamum were rulers of this area, including they ruled Thyatira most of the time, the people would be safe from the Seleucid king's attack. As a result, the very, very close relations between Thyatira and Pergamum. It's about 48 miles from what I read from Pergamon to Thyatira, and it's on the road that goes on down to Sardis, where we'll be next time. But if all was well in Thyatira, then all went well for the entire kingdom of Pergamum, because they controlled that major road there. This is, again, a photo from about 1900 by William Ramsey. And again, you can see the valley there, and you can't see much architecture, can you, like we've been seeing in most of these sites. But even though Thyatira was a garrison city, it was always important to whichever kingdom who was in control because of its military strength. But even though it had a military there, it didn't look much like a fortress. As this picture here depicts, it was in an open valley bordered by gently sloping hills. Well, there was a little bit of elevation. They didn't have the powerful Acropolis like Pergamum or even Smyrna. And the whole look of the area really was not one of strength, but one of weakness. A visitor to Thyatira would never imagine it as an important city, or especially not a capital of an empire. But it was built to serve a kingdom by blocking the path of any enemy. Ramsey wrote about it. He said, the military spirit of the soldier citizens had to be encouraged to the utmost. This tendency towards militarism must inevitably characterize Thyatira in all times of uncertainty and of possible warfare. The function of the city was to make a weak position strong, supply a defect, and guard against an ever-threatening danger. As a garrison city, it would never be very large. A large population would have detracted from its military strength. Under the Romans, it did grow to a reasonable size, but it wasn't that large for most of its history. Religion-wise, the religion of the ancient cities somewhat summed up the character of the city. But again, little is known about the ancient religion of Thyatira. Most of what we know is from the coins that were produced during the time. This is a depiction of one of the coins, and it often coins depicted their hero, and this is just identified in this one as the hero of Thyatira. But the hero's name was Tyrimnos, Tyrimnus, and often depicted going out on horseback, as we have here, with a battle axe, which we have here, on his shoulder, showing the function of the city was to conquer and do battle with their enemies. And this hero seems to be closely related to the nature god Propolis and was viewed as the divine ancestor of Thyatira. The temple that was in front of the village, there's a temple in front of the city that was to this particular nature god and hero, Tyrimnus. I have a hard time pronouncing that one. Helios, the sun god, was also worshipped in Thyatira. And they also worshipped one, and again, it's based upon this hero, and it was sort of a combination of two or three of the gods. And he was known as Helio, they have Helios, Pythian, Tyrimnian, Apollo. So a mixture of Greek and Anatolian gods. The local nature god and a military god, Apollo. He's never named on coins, but he's depicted wearing only a cloak and holding a laurel branch. He's depicted in this one here with the emperor, and they're shaking hands there. But he stood for his city in alliance with Pergamum, and sometimes was even depicted as a female figure. Emperor worship itself was quite weak from what we can tell. Thyatira had an accepted Jewish population. If you remember, we mentioned this a few lessons ago. Seleucus I, who was the founder of the Greek Thyatira, is mentioned by Josephus as showing special favor to the Jews. And he made them citizens throughout all the cities that he founded in Asia. So the Jews had citizenship in Thyatira. And this indicates that there is undoubtedly a Jewish population there. And if you think about it, we know of Lydia from the book of Acts when Paul was in Philippi. Lydia was from Thyatira. She's described as God-fearing, which would probably does indicate that she was a convert to Judaism from the local population. And when Paul was in Philippi, he went out to the riverside where there'd be a small group of Jews, and she's one of them there who are there on the Sabbath day. Thyatira had been under Roman control since somewhere around 190 BC. Or possibly later on during the times of Augustus, but it was under Roman control. Under the Roman peace, it no longer needed to be a garrison city. Although it did continue as a military home, it had a military aspect to the local gods. It grew and became wealthy under the Romans, became a center of communication. And remember, its location there in that valley along the major road, that would be very conducive, become a center of communication. Also a center of trade, again, on that main road. And especially for the royal purple. Keep in mind, it was the home of Lydia. She was a seller of purple goods. This purple dye that they used to color their cloth and their garments was extracted from the root of a plant. I have no idea what this plant looks like. It's called the madder plant, Madder. Found in abundance around the city. The color I'm led to understand was actually Turkish red, but it was considered the royal color, as only those of great wealth could afford to purchase the cloth that had been dyed with it. Lydia probably not only sold purple cloth, she may have sold purple garments as well. And she could have immigrated to Philippi to establish trade in Thyatira and manufactured garments away in Philippi. Thyatira had loads of businesses. We do have some inscriptions, and those inscriptions show that it was full of trade guilds. Sorry, I should have circled Thyatira there, but full of trade guilds. Trade guilds would be dedicated to a particular god. Ramsay writes, it is therefore not surprising that more trade guilds are known in Thyatira than in any other Asian city. The inscriptions, though not especially numerous, mention the following: woolworkers, linen workers, makers of outer garments, dyers, leather workers, tanners, potters, bakers, slave dealers, and bronzesmiths. Garments were sold ready made, being all loose and free. So loads of business going on there. The thing was, though, with trade guilds dedicated to a particular pagan god, you had to join the appropriate trade guild to be able to conduct business. We have no record as to how the Jews handled this problem, because part of what they would have done would have been offering sacrifices to pagan gods. And it also would cause problems for the Christians who lived there. Ramsay said, hence, there was a general tendency among the Christians to avoid situations, offices, and paths of life in which the performance of idolatrous ceremonies was necessary. And on this account, they were generally stigmatized as morose, hostile to existing society, and deficient in active patriotism, if not actually disloyal. Anytime you have people that won't go along with everybody else, it does create problems. We do not know when the message of Jesus arrived in Thyatira. Lydia became a God-fearer amongst the Jews there, was in Philippi. Some suggested she could have taken the good news of Jesus back. Though I would suggest it's probably while Paul was at Ephesus, because the text there in Acts said that the good news went out from Ephesus all through the province. So I have a feeling as well Paul was in Ephesus that the message of Jesus came here. It did become a center of activity by the Nicolaitans. We've seen them a couple other times with their idolatry, their licentiousness, and we're going to read about a prophetess there who defied really the congregation. But other than that, we know very little of the history of Thyatira. Ramsay wrote this, and granted it was over 100 years ago, but it's pretty much the same today. The history of Thyatira is a blank. It's only those cities whose situation exposes them to destruction by every conqueror, yet compels their restoration after every siege and sack. It lies right in the track of invasion. It guards the passage to a rich district, and hence it must be defended to the last, and so provoke the barbarity of the assailant. But it could never be made a really strong fortress in ancient warfare so as to resist successfully. The land did not lend itself to that. Its situation defines its history, but the history has not been recorded. I quite liked that. At the time of the revelation, it would still be a small city, probably just beginning to grow. It reached its height in the 2nd century, as far as population goes, about 100 years after this. It's now in the city of Akhisar, in Turkey. So that's where it is. I'll show you some photos. Some as we headed down towards but didn't make it, and then some from the other things we have. This is after we left Pergamum, heading down towards Akhisar. And again, you can see some of the hills, some of the lay of the land there. Of course, the bus broke down and the sun was setting. with our bus breaking down. Too late, but of course, we were wondering how we were going to get to Izmir, where we're supposed to spend the night. And it got dark before we were rescued, but we did get to Izmir. Had a fantastic meal that night, by the way. Next day, went to Sardis, and then we headed once again we headed to Philadelphia, and then we decided to go on towards Thyatira. Well, at least that was the plan. But bus problems again, and that's the back of our bus. It was spewing water everywhere. Once again, we broke down, sun setting, no hope of ever seeing the ruins of Thyatira because we're heading south the next day. So here is what we missed. So Jill, you were on the tour, I believe. So here's what we missed. This is the ruins of Thyatira, right in the middle of Akhisar. Population of Akhisar it was in 2022 177,419. So not a huge city, but a pretty good sized city, well over pushing 200,000. So it is a good sized city today. And here's some more of the ruins. Again, you can see there's not a whole lot. From what I can tell, it's sort of a square in the middle of Akhisar. This is a colonnaded road. You can see where the columns would have been and the road that would have ran through there. And the picture I showed at the very beginning, some of the arches that probably were on those columns going down there. But again, you can always see in the background the town, it's the city itself. And here's some more of the Thyatira excavations that they've done. Like most sites, there seems to be quite a few fragments of columns that have been dug up and are laying there on display. And those are quite intricate. You can see people carved into some of those there. And there's some more of those architectural fragments there that they've found there in Thyatira. And like most of the Roman sites, there was a basilica, a church, ancient church, and dedicated, as most of them are, to John the Apostle. And there is one there on this particular site. But looking through the photos we had in that packet, that's about all there is. And when we weren't able to make it to Thyatira, Ian Stars told us, our group leader told us that he'd been there, and he says there's not a whole lot to see. So there really doesn't seem to be much there. So missing it may not have been a major loss, except we weren't able to go there. So we did not make it there. Let's get into the text. Of the letters, this is the longest one. So it's got a bit more text to it than we've seen in some of the others. Verse 18, Revelation 2. Write to the messenger of the congregation in Thyatira, the Son of God, with eyes like a fiery flame, feet like glowing bronze, says these things. And we're going to go into the message in just a minute. Ramsey says, this is in many respects the most obscure, but and it's certainly the longest, and probably in a historical view, the most instructive of all the 7 letters. Its obscurity is doubtless caused in a considerable degree by the fact that the history of Thyatira and the character and circumstances of the city in the 1st century after Christ are almost entirely unknown to us. What we've seen in previous letters, how the condition of the city were reflected in both how Jesus was identified, as well as some of the content of the letter, isn't as easily discernible in this letter. This isn't because it didn't reflect the city, but again, we don't know that much about Thyatira. Notice how Jesus identifies himself. The Son of God with eyes like a fiery flame, feet like glowing bronze. And again, that's the identification of Jesus back in chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. This, by the way, is the only time in the entire Revelation that Jesus is referred to as Son of God. We don't find that anywhere else, although it's very, very common, that description in John's other writings. It's possibly emphasizing, when he talks about his eyes like a fiery flame, that he's the one who saw everything. is telling us he's aware of them. He's going to say that in just a minute. Feet like glowing bronze, maybe speaking of destructive power, but that, from what we can tell, would have reflected more of what was going on in Thyatira. Notice on this coin, it depicts a Thyatiran bronzesmith. So this is something those in Thyatira could identify with due to the bronze working that went on in the city. From what we can gather, this was probably a center for making this very bright bronze, although we don't have any details about any of that. But that's how Jesus identifies himself. And he starts into the letter itself. I know your works, love, faith, service, and steadfastness, and that your last works are more than the first. He's aware of what they were doing, of their love, of their faith, their service, their remaining true to Jesus. He knows what they're going through. He knows that they are remaining faithful. In fact, isn't that a good compliment? Your last works are more than the first. We see a group of Christians here who are growing. They're not static, becoming more and more energetic. And then we hit a but. And when you hit a but, you know that something's not quite right. So that looks really nice. But we get to the next verse. But I have this against you. You tolerate the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess. She teaches and seduces my slaves to fornicate, to eat sacrifices to idols. I gave her time to change her heart about her fornication, but she refuses to do so. I will throw her into a bed, and those who commit adultery with her into great distress unless they change their hearts. In addition, I will kill her children by pestilence, and all the congregations will know that I am the one who searches minds and hearts. And I will give to you each one according to your works. Ramsey writes, there is considerable resemblance between the Thyatiran and Pergamanian letters. These were the only two of the 7 cities which had been strongly affected by the Nicolaitan teaching. And I'll cut in here. If you remember, they were mentioned in the letter to Ephesus as well, but those Christians in Ephesus were standing against them. Seems they had a foothold in Thyatira and Pergamum. Both letters are dominated by the strenuous hatred of the writer for that heresy. Moreover, these 2 cities lay a little apart from the rest, away to the north. And so the idea being that maybe because they were so much further north than the others geographically, that they may have taken more of a stronghold there, whereas it's being opposed below those cities to the south of them. The one thing he had against them was great. They tolerated sin in their midst, and here it's described as the woman Jezebel. Net Bible translates as that woman Jezebel. So you get the idea. We don't know if that was really her name, or if this is just a reference to her by alluding to the evil queen who is the wife of Ahab. Jezebel's a Jewish name, so it may indicate that she was a Jewish Christian, a Jew who'd become a Christian. Although not named as following the teaching of the Nicolaitans or the teachings of Balaam, as we saw in Pergamum, the description is the same, seducing Christians to eat sacrifices to idols, to be involved in idol worship. So it's assumed that is what Jezebel was advocating. Ramsey writes, in whatsoever society or company or meeting or ceremonial, the condition of presence and membership lay in the performance of the pagan ritual as an expressed and declared act of religion. The Christian must have no part or lot and could not accept membership or even be present. Here, the Nicolaitans took the opposite view and could defend their opinion by many excellent, thoroughly reasonable, and highly philosophic arguments. That seems to be what's going on, and they were probably defending what they were doing. Even though the Christians were tolerating this terrible teaching, this terrible practice, notice what it said in the previous verse. It had not stopped them doing the good that they were doing. That goes to show that doing good does not mean they were necessarily following Jesus. They were doing good and they were tolerating sin at the same time. So I'm quite sure there's a lesson in that for us. Ramsey again writes, there was no serious general active opposition to her, and therein lay the fault of the whole congregation. She had firmly established herself in the approval of the congregation, and as we've seen, she was so respected because of her liberal and zealous and energetic life that she had deserved public esteem. She was undoubtedly doing good things, but she was involved in some terrible sin. In fact, the text tells us she called herself a prophetess. The idea of being a prophetess is that she's delivering communications from God, God speaking to her, and she's giving new teaching that she claims is from God. Stephen Travis, in his book, The Church Under Fire, which is the letters to 7 churches, says there is in the church a woman of great spiritual power who's gained quite a following by her forceful teaching, her commanding personality, and her words from the Lord, which seemed so relevant, so persuasive. And what is her message that has caught so many people's imagination? She teaches a faith which seeks to mix the Christian gospel with the various popular religious movements and guilds of the city. By the way, notice there, she called herself a prophetess. What does that tell us? She really wasn't. She is one that gave herself that title. Her life told a totally different story. She was teaching and leading the Christians to commit acts of immorality, which would have been part of the pagan worship, and to eat foods sacrificed to idols. Gene West, in his commentary, wrote, the Jezebel of Thyatira, no doubt, taught the Christians that they could belong to the guilds dedicated to various heathen gods. For the sake of daily income, she taught them to eat things dedicated to idols and to commit fornication. Hence, her teaching did not vary greatly from that of Jezebel, wife of King Ahab. Notice what she was teaching was really, the text tells us, seduction and deception. These were similar problems to what the other congregations were going through. I think by looking at these letters, we can see the intense political and social pressure that was put on Christians to conform to the worship of local gods and to conform to the worship of the emperor as well. Stephen Travis writes, at Pergamum, some Christians' lives were threatened by the emperor cult. At Thyatira, their livelihood is threatened by the trade guilds. Perhaps it's easier to recognize and resist the pressure of a political regime than the pressure that comes from social and economic forces. How often does, when it starts hitting our pocketbook, that we start changing our views, even though Jesus says not to do it? But she's taken upon herself, this Jezebel took upon herself to be a teacher of the congregation, and the rest were allowing her to do as she pleased. A chap named David Steele that Gene West quoted said, permitted to usurp the functions of a public teacher, she seduced Christ's servants to join in the abominable rites of the heathen. Not a pretty picture. Again, that contrast, he knows they're doing good things, but look at what they were allowing to go on in their midst. And Jesus continues. He says in verse 20, He says he gave her time to change her heart about her fornication, but she refuses to do so. She's been warned to change. She's been given sufficient time to change, but she's still continuing to do as she had done. She doesn't want to change her heart about her fornication. And basically, what Jesus is saying is he's about to take action. He says she'd be thrown into a bed, and apparently, this Greek word could also be translated dining couch, and that may make sense in the whole idea of pagan worship. And not only her, but those who commit adultery with her would receive great distress. And if you're using an older translation, it may have that word tribulation there. That's simply an old English word for suffering, for distress. So, yeah, that's what's going to happen. And that Bible study note says that the Greek for onto a bed in this context is an idiom for severe illness. The suffering here is not specified as physical or emotional could involve could involve persecution. But the Greek tense here is that continuous tense. I am throwing her into a bed. This has already begun. She and her followers are going to suffer. There was a way of escape, and that way of escape was changing their hearts, changing what they were doing and what they were teaching. He says, in addition, her children would be struck dead by pestilence. Languages sometimes amuse me. The Greek literally here is, I will kill with death. I guess if they're dead, they're killed. So there, but I'll kill with death. That's what's going to happen to them. Most commentators take the position that this is not speaking of literal children, but those who had embraced her teaching. Gene West and others point out that they had already been dealt with in this letter, and that this very well could be literal children. So the commentators go both directions. And if it was literal children, they were to die, that would add to her suffering. But the picture we get in all this is that all who are involved with her and her sinful activities are going to be punished. And this would show all the congregations that Jesus was the one who searches minds and hearts. Again, Greek literally here, he's one who searches the kidneys and hearts, because they thought that various parts of the body did things other than what we know. And that gives to us according to what we've done. Notice he says, I am the one. That's that Greek ego eimi. They would know that Jesus was, I am, that he was indeed deity. Although, we often cry for justice, the true, pure justice that Jesus is going to bring, I doubt that that's really what we have in mind when he describes what he's going to do here in Thyatira. By the way, this picture of Thyatira somewhat contrasted with that of Ephesus. Think about Ephesus, that letter, the first letter. The Christians were concerned about maintaining faithful teaching, faithful discipline, not allowing the false teaching. But their problem was very little love. In Thyatira, the Christians are involved in serving others. They have the love, but they were tolerating the sin. So it tells you that it's not one or the other. We've got to have both, being true to God's word and living a life that is loving and serving and working, helping others. Leslie Thomas, in his commentary, says the Thyatirans demonstrated their faith and love by their good deeds, but they lacked sufficient zeal to maintain sound doctrine and discipline. They tolerated sinful teaching and practice even where there was no participation in them. It doesn't seem like they were all involved in this, and we're going to see that in just a minute, but they were tolerating those who were involved in it. That's why Jesus goes on to say, but I assure the rest of you in Thyatira, as many as do not have this doctrine, who have not known the deep things of Satan, as they say, that I will not put another burden on you. Hold fast what you have until I come. So the message for the rest in Thyatira was don't get involved in this sinful activity that Jezebel's leading. Notice that Jezebel and her followers were claiming some sort of deep knowledge, although it's really from Satan. We see as well that even though a group of Christians can largely be involved in sin, there can still be some in that group who are faithful. And that's what we're seeing in Thyatira. No other burden given them. Just hold fast what you have until he comes. By the way, it's not talking about end of the world here, not talking about him coming in judgment, or not talking about him coming physically. He's coming in judgment. And just hold on. No other burdens. They've got enough on their plate to not have to worry about anything else. Gene West writes, all this evil seems to have come in all these churches from some Jewish source. We have the synagogue of Satan, the throne room of Satan, and now the deep things of Satan. However, since some of the saints, we would hope most of the saints in Thyatira had not subscribed to these horrible and sinful views, Christ would place upon them no greater burden. They just need to hold fast what they have. By the Greek word until I come, the Greek word there for come is from the word exos, E-X-O-S, and it means to roar, to sound, to make a great noise. Gene says, Jesus was not referring to a final coming, the end of the universe as we know it, but he's telling them to be faithful until they heard the sound, the great roar of his coming. We take this to refer to the roar of armies surrounding a military objective. Jesus urged the faithful disciples to be faithful until they heard his lion's roar of victory. This they would hear when the destruction of Jerusalem was accomplished. So what we see here in Thyatira, their lot in life is going to be difficult, especially if they are refusing to be associated in any way with pagan idolatry. They could not be part of a trade guild, and if they weren't in a trade guild, they couldn't conduct any business. You can't conduct any business, you have no means of income. They're going to have a difficult time as Christians. But he's saying to them, don't give in, hang on. The last couple verses, to him who overcomes, who keeps my works until the end, I will give authority over the nations. He will rule them with an iron rod, as clay vessels are broken. And as I have received of my Father, I will give to him the morning star. Let him who has an ear hear what the Spirit says to the congregations. The one who overcame, the one who conquers, was the one who would be faithful and active to the end. Those who overcame would be given authority over the nations. Ramsey says it could not escape the attention of an Asian reader at that time that this irresistible power and strength were promised to the city, which, as at that time the smallest and feeblest, and in general estimation the least distinguished and famous of all that should be 7 cities, except perhaps Philadelphia, which might vie with Thyatira for the last place on the list. Thus Thyatira, of all the 7 cities, seemed in every way the least fitted by nature and by history to rule over the nations. Gene West says that this simply means that the gospel would be preached to the Gentiles and they would be submissive to it. The result would be the gospel rule in the hearts of men. And I think that's what it's talking about, ruling over the nations. He would shepherd them. That's what the Greek literally says. Rule is actually the Greek word shepherd. He would shepherd them with an iron rod. And that word for iron rod in Greek also means a scepter, as clay vessels are broken. That's an Old Testament quote, by the way. It's in Psalm 2, verses 8 and 9. It's in Isaiah 30, verse 14, Jeremiah 19, 11. Now, when I hear he will rule them with an iron rod, in my mind, come up with a very harsh rule that could not be broken. But rather than that, it seems to be just referring to a very strong rule that this scepter you're not going to be able to overcome. You can't break this scepter. This is permanent rule. Jesus' rule is the permanent one. Those who yielded to Jesus' loving shepherding, because that's what it is, would have their old rebellious nature destroyed by the good news of Jesus, as clay vessels are broken. Um, so that seems to be what's going on there. He goes on to say, I will give him the morning star as he had received it from the Father. Now, the morning star is Venus. Venus is the harbinger, the first light of day, a symbol of new hope after darkness. Gene West wrote, the promise is based on the Old Testament saying that in the Messianic kingdom, the righteous would shine as the stars. This being the case, it must refer to the glory given to the ones victorious over the persecutions and tribulations to be suffered in their near future. The morning star, the brightest of all the stars when it comes out. And Jesus, by the way, is referred to as the morning star in Revelation 22:16. So he is the one they're going to receive. As Robertson word picture simply put it, Christ is the bright morning star. The victor will have Christ himself. Hang on. You're part of Jesus. You're going to get Jesus as a result. And Stephen Travis says the morning star alludes to the prophet of Balaam back in Numbers 24:17. A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will arise out of Israel. So you can see that reference there, which came to be understood as a promise of the Messiah. Jesus himself is called the bright morning star in Revelation 22:16. So that's the promise they're given. And I always like the way these letters end. Those who could hear, those who have ears, they need to hear, they need to listen to what the Spirit had to say. You know, these letters were not just something to look at and then put aside. This is Jesus' instructions to them and how they needed to change their lives. So they've received this, those in Thyatira. If you're faithful, hold on. If you're not, you need to get your act together because bad things are going to come if you're following this prophetess. Anyway, that's our text. This is a time we can find any lessons that we can apply to ourselves. So, anybody have anything there that sort of sprang to mind as we're going through that? Things that we can learn for our lives. We run through a couple lessons. We're approaching the 9 o'clock hour. Keep in mind, Jesus always knows what we're going through. It's interesting. He starts every letter. I know what you're going through. I know what you're doing. So he always knows that. So keep that in mind. Interesting. The real power was not in the persecutors. The real power was in Jesus. Faithfulness meant they'd have victory in their lives and in their deaths, if that's what it came to. So, despite their pressure from without and within, they needed to stay faithful to Jesus. And I had some things that came to mind, sort of as questions. Do we choose the path of least resistance in life or the awkward route of costly obedience? It's too easy to take the path of least resistance. And yet sometimes when we do that, we're going against what God's word says. And another one, a question, are we enticed by the world to compromise our faith in Jesus? Because that seems to be what's happening there. They are enticed by the world to do that. Stephen Travis wrote, what could be more reasonable than the suggestion that unless we are immersed in the world's everyday affairs, we are in no position to offer a Christian witness to society? Are we not supposed to be salt and light in the world? Yet John is telling us that there are times when the only authentic witness is the witness which accepts the risk of being misunderstood and isolated from society for the sake of loyalty to the true God. It's the silent witness of suffering and death, like the witness of Christ himself. It's so easy to try to justify getting sucked up into the world, being involved in worldly things, just to say, we're trying our best to show Jesus. Yet sometimes showing Jesus would mean we need to step back. And the final one I had was, do we listen to influential people without checking what they're teaching against God's word? Which is exactly what Hendy said. So, yeah, I saw that one as well. Got to be careful about that because sometimes we can get so mesmerized. I know a Christian in Scotland just now who's mesmerized by a particular guy's teaching, and she's advocating he's teaching some different things, and they're directly against God's word. But because he teaches them, it's got to be correct, and they're not willing to go with God's word. So it's difficult. It's difficult. Anyway, that's the letter to Thyatira. Next week we're going to move on to Sardis. We'll talk a little bit about what's there on the site as well, and we'll look at the letter that was sent to Sardis. If you notice, Sardis is a short letter compared to Thyatira, 6 verses, and that's it. So we'll look at the letter to Sardis. Obviously, don't forget Mark's class on Mondays, and continue, and also the podcast on YouTube on Sundays. Keep in mind those things. This weekend we're starting our lessons on God, evidence for God, Jesus, and the Bible here in East Kilbride. So if you get a chance to come through to that, if you're up in our area, feel free to come along. Second weekend will be the first weekend in September, if that made any sense. Also, don't forget the family retreat in mid-September at Letton Hall in Norfolk, if you're able to get down to that. Register for that online. And also, don't forget our study week coming up at Bassenfeld Manor in the Lake District. 3rd to 7th of November, Israel following the exile. Looking forward to that.